The sun hung low in the sky, casting an amber glow over the quiet town of Dry Creek. Dust danced in the air as a warm breeze rolled through the deserted main street. Clint Eastwood, a man whose reputation carried both respect and fear, rode slowly into town. His worn duster coat flapped slightly as he guided his horse through the uneven dirt road. The old saloon sign creaked in the wind, and the few townsfolk who were outside gave him cautious glances before retreating into their homes and businesses. Clint wasn't a man of many words. He let his actions speak for him, and those actions had built a legend that stretched across the western frontier. Once a lawman, then a drifter, now something in between. He didn't go looking for trouble, but trouble always seemed to find him. As he reached the saloon, he dismounted his horse Dusty and tied the reins to the post. He patted the animal's neck before stepping onto the wooden porch. With a slow, deliberate push, he opened the swinging doors and entered the dimly lit room. Inside, the smell of whiskey and stale tobacco filled the air. A few men sat at tables, their voices hushed. The bartender, an aging man with a graying mustache, glanced up and gave Clint a slow nod. "Whiskey?" Clint said, his voice low and gravelly. The bartender poured a glass without a word, sliding it across the counter. Clint took the glass and sipped, letting the warmth settle in his chest. A few stools down, a man in a dark suit sat nursing his own drink. He was clean-shaven, with an air of authority about him. He turned slightly to Clint and nodded. "You're Eastwood, aren't you?" Clint didn't reply immediately. He set his glass down and studied the man before answering. "Depends who's asking." The man smirked. "Name's William Carter. Used to be a banker out in El Paso. Now, I run things here in Dry Creek." "Running things usually means trouble," Clint muttered. Carter chuckled. "Only if people don't follow the rules. You see, Dry Creek's a quiet place. I intend to keep it that way, and I don't take kindly to strangers stirring up dust." Clint took another sip of his whiskey, unfazed. "I ain't looking for trouble, just passing through." Carter leaned in slightly. "Then you best keep it that way." The tension in the room thickened. A few men at nearby tables glanced at each other, as if expecting something to happen. Clint remained calm, his expression unreadable. He had dealt with men like Carter before, ones who thought power meant control, ones who believed they could decide a man's fate with a few carefully placed threats. Before Clint could respond, the doors swung open again. A young woman in a simple blue dress stepped inside, her face pale and worried. She scanned the room until her eyes landed on Clint. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice trembling, "I need your help." Clint turned slightly, his eyes narrowing. He didn't know the woman, but there was something in her tone that told him she was desperate. Carter let out a low chuckle. "Seems like trouble found you anyway." Clint ignored him and focused on the woman. "What's the problem?" She hesitated for a moment, then said, "It's my father. He's missing, and I think he's in danger." Clint glanced around the room, feeling the weight of every gaze on him. He sighed, setting his glass down. "All right, miss. Let's talk." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the saloon doors as if whispering a warning. Trouble had come to Dry Creek, and Clint Eastwood was about to walk straight into it. Clint Eastwood sat in the dimly lit corner of the saloon, his weathered face expressionless as he nursed a glass of whiskey. Outside, the wind howled through the dusty streets, rattling the shutters of the old buildings that lined the main road. The air was thick with tension. The townsfolk who had initially greeted him with cautious optimism now kept their distance, stealing wary glances his way as if afraid to pin their hopes on him. Marshal Tobias Kane sat across from him, his fingers nervously drumming against the tabletop. The man had been relentless in his pleas, practically begging Clint to help rid the town of the gang terrorizing it. Clint had given no clear answer, neither accepting nor rejecting the marshal's request. He wasn't a hero, never had been, never would be. But something about the marshal's eyes, the quiet desperation, the weight of responsibility, unsettled him. "You sure know how to make a man wait, Eastwood," Tobias muttered, his voice rough with frustration. Clint took a slow sip of his drink before setting the glass down. "You mistake me for someone who cares," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I didn't ride in here looking for trouble." "You didn't have to. Trouble finds men like you." Clint's eyes flicked up, meeting Tobias's gaze. The marshal held his ground. That earned him a sliver of respect. Most men wouldn't have dared challenge him, not after hearing the stories that trailed in his wake. Clint let out a long breath and leaned back in his chair, listening to the saloon's quiet murmurs. Somewhere in the back, a man plucked a slow, melancholic tune on an out-of-tune piano. "They call themselves the Black Spurs," Tobias said, breaking the silence. "Led by a man named Silas Graves. They've bled this town dry for years. We tried standing up to 'em, but—" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You've seen what they do to people who don't cooperate." Clint had indeed seen the aftermath. The burned homes, the beaten and broken shopkeepers, the fearful eyes of children who had learned too young that monsters weren't just in bedtime stories. It reminded him of places he'd been before. Places where men like Graves took everything from those too weak to fight back. And it reminded him why he never stayed anywhere too long. "I ain't a lawman, Kane," Clint said. "And I sure as hell ain't interested in dying for a town I don't belong to." Tobias exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You got somewhere better to be?" Clint didn't answer. He wasn't sure he had an answer. The saloon doors swung open with a bang, drawing every eye in the room. 3 men stepped inside, each dressed in black dusters, their boots clicking against the wooden floorboards. The Black Spurs had come calling. One of them, a broad-shouldered brute with a thick beard and a scar running down his cheek, scanned the room before locking eyes on Tobias. A slow, cruel grin stretched across his face. "Well, well," he drawled, sauntering forward. "Marshal Kane, sitting all cozy with a stranger? You boys discussing ways to get yourselves killed?" Tobias didn't flinch, though Clint could see his jaw tighten. "You got business here, Boone?" Boone's grin widened. "Always. You know how it is. Mr. Graves likes to make sure everyone remembers who's in charge." His gaze flicked to Clint. "And who the hell might you be?" Clint didn't respond. He simply picked up his whiskey and took another sip. Boone's smile faltered. He took a step closer. "I asked you a question, old man." Clint set his glass down and turned his head just enough to meet Boone's eyes. A slow, deliberate motion. The saloon had gone silent, everyone holding their breath. Tobias shifted in his seat, his hand resting near his holster. Boone's grin returned, but there was an edge to it now. "Ah, I see. One of those types." He leaned in. "Think you're too good to speak, huh?" Still, Clint said nothing. His silence was louder than any words could have been. Boone's face darkened, his patience wearing thin. "Maybe we need to teach you some manners." Clint moved so fast that Boone didn't even have time to blink. One moment, the gunslinger was sitting with his drink. The next, Boone was doubled over, gasping for breath, Clint's hand gripping his wrist like a steel vise. The thug's fingers twitched near his holster, but Clint twisted his arm sharply, forcing him down to one knee. The other 2 men drew their pistols in an instant, but Tobias was faster, his revolver already aimed squarely at the nearest one's head. "Drop it," he warned. Clint kept his grip on Boone, his voice quiet but carrying all the weight of a death sentence. "I ain't much for talking, kid, but if you want to keep that hand, I'd suggest you walk out of here and tell your boss he's got one chance to leave this town for good." Boone wheezed, eyes wide with pain and rage. For a moment it seemed like he might still try something stupid. Then with a grunt of fury, he yanked his arm free and staggered back. His men hesitated before slowly lowering their weapons. Boone glared at Clint, rubbing his sore wrist. "You just made a mistake, old man." Clint picked up his whiskey again, took a sip, and smirked. "Wouldn't be my first." Boone spat on the floor, then turned and stormed out, his men trailing after him. The saloon doors swung shut behind them, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Tobias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Well," he muttered, "guess that answers my question." Clint sighed, tipping back the rest of his drink. He had no plans to stay, no plans to fight another man's war. But deep down he knew he wasn't riding out of this town just yet. Trouble had found him once again, and this time he wasn't so sure he'd be able to walk away. Clint took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows over the empty streets. He tightened his grip on the old revolver in his holster, a relic from a past that refused to let him go. Tonight, everything would end. As he stepped into the abandoned warehouse, the scent of oil and rust filled his nostrils. The dim glow of a single overhead bulb cast eerie silhouettes on the cold concrete floor. In the center of the room stood Mason Carter, his former partner turned bitter enemy, flanked by two heavily armed men. "Clint," Mason greeted, a smug grin stretching across his face. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Clint remained silent, his eyes scanning the room for any advantage. He had spent years chasing Mason, trying to bring him to justice. Now it all came down to this. "You're outnumbered, old man," Mason continued, motioning to his men. "This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. Walk away and I'll pretend this never happened." Clint chuckled, the sound low and gravelly. "You know me better than that, Mason." Mason sighed, feigning disappointment. "Have it your way." Before Mason could give the order, Clint moved. With the reflexes of a man who had seen more battles than he cared to remember, he drew his revolver and fired. The first shot struck the man to Mason's left, sending him crashing to the ground. The second found its mark in the chest of the other, his gun clattering to the floor as he fell. Mason barely had time to react before Clint was on him. The two men struggled, years of unresolved hatred boiling to the surface. Fists met flesh, bones cracked, and the sound of grunts and curses echoed through the warehouse. Mason reached for his gun, but Clint was faster. With a swift kick, he sent the weapon skidding across the floor. Pinning Mason against a stack of crates, Clint pressed the barrel of his revolver to his old friend's temple. "It's over, Mason," Clint said, his voice steady. Mason's chest heaved, his face twisted in fury. "You think killing me will change anything? The world doesn't care about justice, Clint. It never did." Clint studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he lowered his gun. "No," he admitted, "but I do." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Clint stepped back as red and blue lights painted the walls. Mason slumped to the ground, defeated. The police burst in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Clint raised his hands in surrender, nodding toward Mason. "He's all yours." As the officers cuffed Mason and led him away, Clint walked outside. The cool night air filled his lungs, washing away the weight of the past. He glanced at the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to break. Another chapter closed. Another battle fought. Clint Eastwood disappeared into the early morning light, a lone figure walking toward an uncertain future. But for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace.